right here. So I want to thank you all for coming. My name is Brooke O'Neill, and I'm going to be your moderator for the panel today. I'm a freelance writer and also a MAPS graduate from 2004, a time during which this event, this GradUCon, did not yet exist, and we all kind of stumbled our way out of school into the real world. So I am so excited you're here today to get a little bit of clarity on publishing inside and outside of the academy. So on our panel today, we have a group that represents pretty much any discipline, I think, that you would want to cover, and also different venues as well. So we have Seth Richardson, who's the managing editor of the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, and also a historian of the ancient Near East. And he's going to be speaking about how you should think about which journals might be a good venue for you to publish in. Next, we have Paul Derica, who is a PhD candidate in English here at the university, and also has an MFA in creative writing. And Paul has been published in Tin House, Mid-America Review, several other very prestigious literary publications. And he's also the fiction editor at another Chicago magazine. So if you're here to hear about the outside of the academy part of publishing, Paul's going to be your guy. Next, we have Trish, who is the managing editor at the American Naturalist, which is a leading science journal. And she's also worked in various sociology publications and other leading science publications as well. And she's going to talk to you about what happens when you send your manuscript off to the publisher's office, what do they do with it, and what are the questions that you should be asking them. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have Andrew Abbott, who many of you probably know, professor of sociology here at the university. He's written 5 books and 100 papers and articles, sat on nearly 100 dissertation committees, and has edited the Works in Occupation and the American Journal of Sociology. So he's going to speak to us about kind of that end decision of what makes or breaks an article, why does it get published or not. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. They're each going to speak for about 5 minutes on their topic, and then we're going to try to take a lot of Q&A from the audience. So we'll start with Seth.
Okay. Hello. I suppose I'm speaking into the microphone. I suppose I was asked not only because I work in professional academic editing, but also because I have experience with authorship as well. Single author books, edited volumes, many articles and reviews and so on and so forth. The edited volumes in a way are sort of an interesting middle range because there I act as something of a curator for our authors, but also the editor. So a little bit of the carrot and the stick, both. At the same time, I'm also coming from a seriology, which is hardly like a paradigm field for most people to model their publishing on. So obviously what I will say will be a little idiosyncratic. It's hard to give advice without sounding like a nag. So forgive me for that, and I'll try to be pithy. Also, if this sounds really super obvious, I guess I just want to reiterate that sometimes these obvious and basic points are the most important because authors can be very good, let's say, at suspending reality when they're chasing the dragon of first-time publication. So I have 5 points, and maybe I'll be more useful in the Q&A. The first thing to say is I personally am very much in favor of students seeking to publish. Taking ownership of your scholarship by publishing is as huge a professional leap as accepting a job. In fact, your scholarship is the only thing about your career that's going to outlast your job, probably. But you'll not look back at your writing as publishing. You'll look back at it as your work, nothing short of who you are, your professional identity. Now, not everyone thinks student publication is a great idea, and there are principled reasons behind this, and the situation varies widely from field to field. So the first encomium here is to gather opinions, plural, as many as you can, okay? There's no one such thing as publication. There's a wide variety of experience. So let's sort of, dispel the idea of the single event. The second point is that, again, seemingly passingly obvious, publication has long-term consequences. So be patient with the preparation and the process. Publication is sort of a medium-term process with permanent results. Don't rush. Don't have publication as your goal. Only the elaboration of good ideas is worthwhile. People evaluating you later on will not be counting, or won't primarily be counting, the number of your publications or the earliest date. They'll be evaluating what's in your publications, okay? In humanities publishing, at least, you're entering an increasingly rare world where slow is good. You will need your patience. So one story I could draw on is that back in 1997, I had just finished writing my MA, and I was telling an advisor that I was really keen on publishing it. And he was very kind and patient, but he looked at me and he said, look, if it's a good idea now, it's going to be a good idea in 3 years. So 15 years later, I finished writing it. And it just happened to be the kind of paper that needed that much time. So how very right he was. I just wrote him this morning, actually. So I just finished this thing. I just sent it off. And a lot of times, waiting can be better. So this leads into point number 3. Think about your paper and not about the prestige of it. It's undeniable that some journals are ranked more highly, indexed more frequently, or regarded more highly. Ignore this. This is a distraction. Or pay attention to it last, when the paper's all written. Admittedly, I work in a field where most journals are neither ranked nor indexed, so it's easy for me to say this to you, and the job decisions in my field are not really linked to those issues, but still, make sure first your paper's written the way it should be, and then think about who your audience is, where it fits in terms of length and topic, and then pick the journal up, physically, please. Okay? Look at the last 5 years. See what subjects it pays attention to these days, how it prefers the presentation of ideas. When you find the journal you like, look at its website, information for authors, its rules for style and submission. If you still have questions, contact the editors. Ask them what you don't know. Try to get a sense of the local ecology of the journal. If you write them, do they reply quickly? Do you get a sense there's a human being on the other end of the line who really pays attention to author queries? If they can't answer your first author query in a timely way, what's it going to be like 6 months from now when you're trying to find out how the review is going or how the copy editing is happening and so on and so forth, okay? Do you sense that they really think that your topic belongs with them? Or is it seeming kind of like a bad fit, okay? Or best of all, I think really talk also to an author, somebody who's recently published in that journal, right? If you appeal to them to describe briefly their experience, how it went for them, what their tips and advice are for dealing with that journal, that's maybe the closest user-end advice that you can get. Fourth, if you can, choose peer review, okay? The review process is not always well spelled out in journal descriptions, and it can be difficult to tell what it means when a journal claims that it has peer review. The best publishing experience I ever had was with a journal which had 4 double-blind reviewers who returned substantial written comments in 2 full rounds, okay? This was their normal process. It absolutely produces the best result. Even after that, there was, of course, copy editing, proofing, and so on and so forth. It's a very simple and nearly infallible rule. The more work is being done on the text, the better it is. If it hurts, you're probably doing it right, okay? Seek out the journal that will really work on your paper, and be wary of journals that have quick schedules, because they're usually, cutting corners on review. If you get the sense that review and editing are abbreviated processes at your targeted journal, but for some reason you have to publish there, get your own peer review process done before you go to them. Faculty, students, friends, your mom and dad, they worked for me. Even when your readers are not in your field, maybe sometimes especially when readers are not in your field, they're going to point out things about clarity that perhaps you haven't seen, okay? You can't control who's going to read your work eventually, and all those different eyes help you revise for audiences that you're inevitably going to get but can't possibly anticipate. So that's all by way of saying get as many people to comment on your paper as possible. Obviously, just like the rest of life, you don't have to take every piece of advice. And the fifth thing I'll say now is that it's about the writing. By the time you're thinking about publication, You've already written 100 term papers. You know how to write those. School papers are exhaustive, complex, and they're kind of built for defense. Writing for publication is different in most cases. Published work is less about citing every piece of evidence you can find. It's not so much about touching on every related topic you can think of. It's not about coverage. Your paper is least effective and convincing when most of it is about refuting previous scholarship. I'd say most of the time keep this to an absolute minimum. You win here by superseding, not by decision. It's about the clear exposition of your ideas and research. You're writing on offense, as it were, to persuade. Your real problem is not usually going to be that you forgot a citation or a source. It's going to be that you didn't make yourself clear. My favorite articles still start with any sentence like, the purpose of this article is X. Okay? Be that plain. And that's what I have to say for now. So, Paul.
Thank you. Okay. Hello? All right, great. Okay, so I guess I'm meant to be representing the outside, and I'm speaking to a bunch of people on the inside. But I actually will sort of talk about how one might begin to do certain work kind of within the academy and then discover that it might actually be of interest or useful for a sort of broader audience. And I can speak actually from personal experience. In my own work, I might be working on a particular project and then doing some research, and I'll come across some like really sort of interesting kind of narrative thread that I can't really sort of integrate into my argument. But I do think that it'll be of interest to a kind of like, informed and kind of like engaged sort of community of readers, a sort of broader community of readers. So what do I do with that piece? Do I just scuttle it, or do I continue to develop it? And in my case, I've often continued to kind of work with this material and then try to find the proper outlet for it. And what I'm going to talk about specifically are certain publications that exist in Chicago, but you can kind of extrapolate from what I'm saying and kind of apply it to wherever you happen to reside after you're done here. One thing to think about when kind of writing for a more sort of more general or broader kind of audience is that the sort of platforms or venues that are available are much more diverse. And I'll just give you a kind of couple of specific examples. There's a publication here that just premiered last year called The Chicagoan. It's a biannual, and it specializes in sort of like long form journalism. So if you're someone in particular who writes in the humanities, it might be a good sort of outlet for that sort of material. One, because it's 64 pages, there's no ads. It actually really allows you to kind of develop a sort of piece of writing. Most of the work that appears in here is sort of journalistic, but it also does have a section devoted to fiction or poetry. Here's another local publication. Oops, I'm holding it upside down. That's really great. It's called Make Magazine. Make is more of a sort of traditional literary journal in some ways. It has a fiction section, a poetry section, nonfiction, but it also does some sort of journalistic work as well. Interviews, reviews. That's one thing, particularly if you're working the humanities in, say, the English department. You can always write reviews of books as well. And I'm not talking about the sort of capsule reviews that you'd find in like the Chicago Reader or New City or something like that, but actually kind of longer, sustained, articles, but for a more sort of general readership. And lastly, I've got Poetry Magazine here. Now, Poetry Magazine obviously has lots of poems in it, but it also contains interviews, reviews, essays written by some of the premier figures in the field, and not just practicing poets, but academics as well. And it might not be the sort of thing that you would think of initially, but it's a well-respected journal. It's been around now for about a century, and it has a very wide readership and diverse readership as well. And these are all just publications based right here in Chicago. One other thing I would like to say, I think a lot of what you said about sort of academic publishing is also true for, say, publishing fiction or poetry or creative nonfiction. Familiarize yourself with the publications, see what kind of work is being done at that moment. Be patient. You might send a piece off and it'll get accepted right away, or you might have to send it off 20 some times, but eventually it'll find a home. So diligence pays off. The other thing, though, I would stress with this sort of body of publications is that oftentimes they'll have some sort of kind of public component to them, or some sort of a program-based component. And that's a really good way both to learn about them and also to kind of get yourself known. So you'll have book releases, or you'll have readings, or some of these publications have reading series attached to them. So I encourage actually kind of going out into the city and kind of attending some of these events and kind of learning about this work that way, and also like engaging some of these people. Another great thing about a lot of these sort of publications, I think it's true though for some academic publications as well, is that they're always looking for people to work on them and to help out. And that's actually really invaluable in terms of when thinking about publishing one's own work, is if you have some sort of editorial experience. If you can become a reader at a publication, or eventually a sort of editorial assistant, you'll get to sort of see what publications are publishing, right? And what they're interested in, and what that criteria is. And it can help you in terms of how you both develop your own work, but how you sort of present it and send it out. If you have to read, 50-some cover letters, right? And a lot of them are awful or just forgettable, then it'll help you to kind of think about how you should write your own cover letters when approaching publications. So I would say that's really a kind of like smart and valuable thing to do if you get that opportunity, is to kind of get involved directly somehow in the publication end, if you're going to be pursuing publication on your own part. I think I'll leave it there.
Great. One question, just for the audience, so we can get a sense of what kind of publishing you guys are looking into. Quick show of hands, how many people here are in the humanities? Okay, how about social sciences? And then hard sciences? All right, one guy back there. All right, great. So that just, maybe that helps with the panel to get a sense of, what you guys are looking at.
Okay, so I'm working at the press, and I work in a journal office, and I came out of humanities, worked around sociologists for a while, and then now in the sciences, so I have a kind of sense of the bigger ecosystem. And the one thing about, that's a theme already, is every journal and probably every publication has a niche. It's a very particular niche, so when they're evaluating your work, it's not just, is it good, is it meet basic standards, it's, does it fit our niche? So that's one of the main purposes of peer review. It's not just, is it good quality? It's, does it fit whatever the theme or the little, the readership of that particular publication? And every journal operates slightly differently. Some of it's field specific, some of it's about economics, how much journal office staff they can afford. And, but basically, I think there's a couple of generalizations that I'm going to try to make, and I can answer more specifics. But I was going to say, particularly for the one hard scientist, I did bring over, it's a recent publication from the press, What Editors Want, an author's guide to scientific journal publishing. There's actually a lot in here about more, particularly the social sciences, impact factor, a lot of that kind of, nitty gritty. So, there's a lot of detail other than my 5 minutes we could go into. So, as I said, the point of peer review is, does it meet the standards of scholarship in this area? Does it fit this journal's niche? Is it readable? And will it interest the readers? Because, it is, even academics is about marketing to readers. The first thing that happens when you submit, you decide this is the place for you, is there's some kind of journal office staff who will look it over. It might be a large staff, might be a grad student. So that's the first pass. So my first bit of very strong advice is follow the instructions to authors. Because the first time you may hear from the journal is right away when you get the article bounced back at you and they say, we need line numbers, we need double spaces. Particularly if it's a complicated blind review journal, they'll need very specific things. And the other component, there's the journal office staff, but a journal is always a community of volunteers. All the peer reviews, all the editors are volunteers. They're doing this because they're committed to their scholarship and they're committed to this journal. They get, some of them, very possessive about the journal. If you don't follow the reference style for that journal, they'll get mad. They'll actually write it in the review. You obviously didn't mean to send it here. You meant to send it somewhere else, and they'll get very touchy. So it's worth really looking at the journal, not just in choosing it, but in mimicking, what it is, to prove that, this is actually where you want your work to appear. So the first thing to do is follow the instructions to authors, and the first time you might hear from the journal is that, you blew it. You didn't do some basic thing to get it into review. The next time you might hear from the journal is that it's been rejected without external review. That means the editorial board looked at it and said, we're not going to spend our valuable volunteer resources on this because it really doesn't have a chance. And it's usually not because the scholarship is so flawed, it's because it's so far away from the niche of the journal. You didn't, make a good choice. You particularly if you're going for prestige instead of a good fit, you quite often hit very much the wrong. They just say, look, no, it doesn't have a chance. Don't take this as a sign of anything about your work, unless they say something. They'll say usually if there's a flaw. Take it as just, I need to go back to the library and find the better niche. And a lot of journals will make a point of suggesting to you, no, here's a journal that might be, more the ballpark for where this manuscript belongs. So that's the next time you might hear from the journal. Then there's a long silence. If you make it through those two hurdles, that's the peer review part. Remember, these are all volunteers, so there's two things that make this long and drawn out. One is that the journal office is having to line up 1 to 4 people who will volunteer to evaluate your paper. A lot of people don't say yes. Sometimes this can take a long time. So if you're writing your abstract, that's your selling point. If you want to get your thing rapidly into review, make that abstract really interesting, because that's going to catch the reviewer's eye and say, oh yeah, hey, I really want to look at this thing. Otherwise, it might not be right to the point, and they'll say, I got to turn in a grant proposal, and so I'm not going to do this. So there's this period of time when they're trying to line up reviews, and then there's always a period of time when reviewers legitimately have to turn theirs in. So usually 3 weeks, sometimes months. That's very field specific. So that takes a while, and you won't hear. And again, this is field specific. Find out, what the kind of time frame you should know about. But if it does seem to be taking a really long time, write in. Sometimes the journal office appreciates that. I use any request like that to nag other people. I say, look, the author is worried. Come on, turn in the review. Taking a step back, so about the review. There are different kinds of peer review. And that can also be part of the labor-intensive aspect of this. A lot of a general form is single blind. That means that the authors will not know who the reviewers are, but the reviewers know who you are. This is supposed to produce more honest reviews, and it also means that a reviewer is protected from retaliation. Particularly, a lot of our reviewers are more junior than the people writing the paper, and this way, they can. Usually, it doesn't. Everybody's pretty fair. We actually kind of patrol that. Then there's double-blind review. It takes journal staff. It's expensive to do. It means that the authors do not know who the reviewers are, but the reviewers do not know who the authors are. And that's another place where preparing your manuscript is important, to help them clean it out, clean out the identifying pieces. Then there's actually triple-blind review. One journal at the press does this, and it's the regular double-blind, but the editors also do not know who the authors are. Only the journal staff knows until a decision who the authors are of a paper. So yeah, follow the instructions, help the journal with the various processes that they're going through. The other thing I'll add to that, in the sciences in particular, is the whole nature of peer review is going up for grabs. There's lots of experiments going on in terms of open review, post-publication review, all kinds of alternatives. But I would say in the humanities and social sciences, it's pretty, these are the, double and single are the standards. So after a long period of time, depending on your field, you hear back with the actual decision. The reviews come in. Reviews are advisory. It's not a democracy. There aren't like 3 votes yes, 1 vote no. It's the editors take the reviews as advisory. The reviewers are more expertise in that area usually and can have different kinds of insights. The editors have a larger perspective, which of course the next speaker will address that point of view. And so you'll get one of 3 kinds of answers: accept right away, this is great; decline, sorry, don't resubmit; and then lots of different forms of maybe. And my one piece of advice is that was hard for me to learn when I was a grad student, was if there's any kind of maybe, take it. The editors mean it. They want to see it again. If you can do what they ask you to do, they'll tell you in the letter, do X, Y, and Z, and try it again, and they mean it. So do take that second chance if they leave the door open. And that's about it, other than I should say again that I have extra copies of this, so anybody who wants a copy of the book, come up afterwards and pick one up.
Great. Thanks, Trish.
Okay, thanks. So you've been told I'm the editor of the American Journal of Sociology. I've been doing that for 12 years. So I'm speaking from a fairly specific place in the system. This is the absolute top of the food chain, the most prestigious journal in the world in its field. I have edited Work and Occupations, which is not the most prestigious journal in sociology. It's more upper middle level sort of thing, but it means that I have a very specific kind of position. I'm dead center in the sort of the academic system itself, so I'll speak just to that. Although I would point out that actually my first publication was outside of academia in the journal Appalachia of the American Appalachian Mountain Club. Kind of interesting. I was remembering that when I was hearing this talk. Maybe I can give you a little sense of what this is actually like from the inside by talking about a journal meeting. The American Journal of Sociology is one of the last journals in the United States to have a weekly editorial board meeting. My 5 co-editors and myself sit around a table every Wednesday morning from 10 to 12 and go through a set of papers. We have in front of us the abstract. Yes, the abstract is extremely important. Make sure your abstract is wonderful. You can't underscore that too much for academic publishing. We have the abstract. We, of course, have the paper. We have the reviews from the reviewers. We always have 3 reviewers. One of the reasons reviews can take a long time is you ask somebody to say, oh, yeah, I'll do that. And then 2 months later, say, no, this is not really for me. And we're suddenly left with a 2-month delay, and we've got to find somebody else. So that's one of the reasons reviewing is taking a long time everywhere in the academic system at this point. It's produced in part by the move to electronics because it's only 2 clicks to say no. Whereas in the old days, you used to get the stuff in the mail, and there it was sitting on your desk, and you kind of said, oh, it's easier to review the damn thing than to send it back. So we're sitting there with the stuff in front of us. Basically, I run this as a Quaker meeting. Everybody reads the abstract, everybody reads the material, the reviews, and then I call in the associate editors in a random order, sometimes starting with the person who's the real expert, sometimes starting the person who doesn't know any of the first thing about what's in the article. And by the time 2 or 3 of us have spoken, there's a pretty clear decision. So it's a very consensual process. If there's any, at the end of the day, there's real disagreements, I make the decisions because I take the responsibility. But 90% of the time, 98% of the time, there's almost complete consensus on the board about virtually everything. That's because we know who the reviewers are. We know this guy says no to everything, and if he says, well, maybe, that's like a rave review. Other people, if they say, oh, that's the most wonderful thing I read, we say, oh, that's not good enough. This guy has to be, the greatest thing I've ever read in my entire life. So I want to underscore this assertion that's been made before. People have said all the things that need to be said really before. A journal is a community. The community includes the authors, who are the people who submit. They also include the reviewers, the people who do the reviews, and often those people are the same people. One of the things that will turn you into a reviewer for a journal is getting something published there. Let me tell you, we decide to finger you forever on after that. But in any case, that's how the process, that's how our decision ends up being made. Most journals do not do this now. Most journals are doing this over email. If they have an editorial board meeting, they're very often letting editors take charge of certain areas. You do all the org stuff. You do all the something, sociology of science or something. American Political Science Review, for example, is basically 4 separate journals in a single wrap. So there's basically a political theory section, an American politics section, a comparative politics section, an IR section, and they're largely separate. They run as separate operations. So once again, to underscore something that's been said before, know your journals. I don't want to say don't write an article on spec, but it's pretty much true. Don't write an article on spec. You should decide fairly early on in the process when you're starting to think about publishing, oh, this is going to go to a particular place. Check that place out. The nitty-gritty, figure out how they want the manuscripts to look, but also what do their articles look like? They tend to have this shape, that shape, the other. So do your homework on that, because if it comes, it's painfully obvious to people on the other end of this if it's not really in the niche. It's really, really clear. So for example, when we get a paper that's got tons and tons of equations in it and it's done in LaTeX, I know it's from an economist and it's been rejected in an economics journal. Clunk. So just think about that stuff. A second thing to point out about going forward, you folks are publishing much, much earlier in your careers than my generation did. Our advisors thought we had absolutely nothing to say until we've been in graduate school for at least 6 years. Many of you are actually being encouraged to publish in the middle of graduate school, so it's one of the things you have to realize. It's a different world out there. I don't know how to tell you to stand on the slice the bologna thin versus the make it a massive thing and make it wonderful kind of approach, because although we'd like to think that nobody out there is bean counting, actually lots of people in academia are out there bean counting. On the other hand, in the long run, it is good articles and serious interventions that have the impact. So you have to kind of think about that. It's not clear to me how that's going to play out in the future. We do know that academia is going to be much more highly stratified in the next 10, 20, 30 years than it is now. It's not clear how. It could be the case that that means that there'll be a return to looking at just, okay, we want to look at the best single publication this person's put out. My friend, the late Roger Gould, used to say tenure would be much better if we said we'll only read 75 pages. So you just want to think about those best 75 pages. A thing to remember about that also is you will write more than one paper. If you write a single article, you're going to write lots of articles. You don't have to say everything you know in your first article. One of the things you can see in these articles, they're very often overstuffed with extra things. A word about the niche of the journal. This is exactly right, what my predecessor has said. A journal has a niche. We have a vision, and I can recite it. The American Journal of Sociology seeks to publish papers that have important new data, important new theory, important new methodology, or that make a decisive intervention in an ongoing debate. Clunk. That's the standard. So that's what we have in our mind. Does this make a decisive intervention? No, it's just routine normal science. Fine, we'll send it to ASR. That's what they do. So remember, you'll write you'll write lots of papers, but it's also true the editors have a vision of what the journal is about. Let me also underscore the fact, ultimately, it's not a due process situation. The editor wants to publish a great journal. The editor has to do his best to be fair to you, and we have processes for that. But in the last analysis, if it's a choice between having been utterly fair to you and having the journal be the best it is, the journal comes first. That's what an editor does. An important thing to realize about this is that everybody in the experience, how many people in this room have reviewed an article, have refereed an article? Okay, so that's a crucial piece of this. You need to try to review articles. I don't know how to get on the list. I mean, obviously people in our department get stuck with it all the time, but it is the case that the 3 major communities involved in journals, the authors, the editors, and the reviewers, all have an experience which is structurally given. Authors in the double-blind process, that's the world I work in, double-blind. Reviewers don't know who the authors are. Authors don't know who the reviewers are. In that world, all authors feel they have been trashed by the reviews. That's just structurally given. It's in the nature of the faith. I've published dozens and dozens of articles in my life, even the articles that were accepted straight out. I didn't feel the reviewers got the idea. Why didn't they understand, these idiots? Why does he want me to do that? I don't want to do that. It's crazy. It's structurally given in the position of being the author that people will allow themselves essentially to say things which we won't say face to face. Some of them are going to feel hurtful. That's all there is to it. What you have to realize is that everybody feels like that. I got to a point in my life where when I got reviews from people from a journal, I would not read them. I would give them to a friend and say, okay, prepare me for this. And that worked much better because before I would just get these things, I would read them, I would go ballistic and be unable to work for 2 weeks because I'm just like that. I get enraged. So if you're an author, you're going to feel like that. It's going to feel a little hard. We all develop a harder skin or whatever, but figure out some way to deal with it. At the same time, it's also the case that all reviewers feel they never get anything good to review. All reviewers feel, why don't you ever send me anything decent? You know. And editors all feel there's not enough to publish. Believe it or not, you guys are submitting, I'm submitting, everybody's submitting. All editors feel, I'm not sure we have a journal for March. I think I actually have a journal for March, which is good. But in other words, there's a whole bunch of structural things here. You're going to feel bad when you get comments on your stuff. It's inevitable. Everybody feels bad. I'm great success in this racket, and I feel bad when I get my reviews. So don't worry about that. It's just one of the things that's going to happen.
You know, I'm wondering if maybe we should take some questions from the audience before we have to wrap up here. Any questions? Bring the mic back to you there.
Sure.
We can take the
I have two questions, actually. Quickly, you said that academia is going to become more hierarchical in 10 to 15 years, and I'd like to know what you mean by that and how so. And secondly, I'd like to ask, a lot of us are going to get PhDs and not get jobs right away, or not get the jobs we want right away, or maybe not get PhDs. And there are people who publish, or who try to publish, who don't have professorial jobs. But that's hard, I understand, and I wonder if any of you can speak to that, either publishing in books or in journals. How can you get published if you don't have an academic job?
Unfortunately, I'm eminently qualified to answer your question. Well, I guess what I'd say is that, and I can only speak from a certain point on in your career rather than at the beginning, but if you have been working and if you have been publishing, a lack of opportunities to publish is not generally your problem. There's kind of too much work to do, not too little. And in a way, that's why I'm saying, I guess partly psychologically, it is very helpful to just continue I don't want to sound like, Kevin Costner at the end of The Untouchables, but just keep writing, keep working. Don't, you have to compartmentalize a little bit what you're doing. The job and the scholarship are coterminous to a certain extent, but not completely. So I'd say keep working at it, and don't worry about that status insofar as enabling you to publish.
I would just say quick that I think it's probably easier to get into book publishing, than, because they're all, even the university presses are a little more like trade publishing, and what they want is a good readable book, But I would say, in my area of science, I can be quite specific. We publish people that aren't in the academy, but they have to write. They have to be good, and they have to be doing they have to sound right. They can't have gotten so far away that they've lost the voice, or they're not up to date, or that's the hard work, I think, is staying up in the right level. But yeah, particularly we have a lot of people that work in government jobs or that kind of thing, and yeah.
I would certainly agree. Nobody in the system cares anything about what the jobs are of the people who submit. The central thing is that if you're not working in academia, you tend to lose this kind of sense of what the hot things are, what's going on, what the journal articles are starting to look like, and that's something you get from the air if you work in the academy, because you're listening to your colleagues complain about it all the time. And so if you're not in the academy, you have to work harder to get that sense, to have that sense of what's going on.
Another question? We're recording this, that's why we're making you all speak into okay.
The hierarchical thing?
That I don't.
Why is this academic system going to get more hierarchical? It's very simple, because the states are broke. And because for-profit education is going to make a serious, very major attempt to take over a lot of the low-end education that's being provided by the American states. And the American states need to build bridges and highways, which are all falling apart. So there's simply going to be much less available money lower down in the system, which means that the sort of proportion, the relative disproportion between places like the University of Chicago that are immensely wealthy, the middle level of the state universities and so on, is just going to become much, much sharper, which means academia is, I think, likely to become much more hierarchical in the next 20 or 30 years. I don't know. The reality about adjuncts is, it's already been the case for at least 2 decades that more than half the credit hours in the United States are delivered by adjuncts. So it's already happened.
So for those of us who are interested in being reviewers, do you have suggestions on how we can go about doing that? Do editors generally accept interest expressed from us? Do we need to wait for a journal to put out a call for reviewers? What would be the best way for us to go about getting involved with that?
No one's going to take you, just as is true for book reviews. Most journals, for example, if you say, I'd be willing to do a book review of X, they won't accept that, because that kind of rules you out. You might be a conflict of interest. But I think no journal is going to think that it's stupid if you've emailed them and said, I'm doing such and such, I just got a degree, I'm just whatever, and I'm willing to review papers in X, Y, Z. Nobody's going to say, oh, that person has 3 heads. So it may work. They may put you on a list. I'm not, we tend to find our reviewers often in the referee lists, in the reference lists of papers. So often the way we find out about new people is they've already published somewhere. But also your advisor is somebody who can put you on lists like this. Often we get advisors say, I'm too busy, but my student X. So I would talk to an advisor about this.
I would also say, actually, even a declined paper, sometimes they'll pick up that, oh, hey, they know about, in my case, frogs, and the next time a frog paper comes along, hey, there was this paper, it wasn't right for us, but wow, they really knew about frogs. So, so actually submitting can get you kind of on people's minds. So it's participating in the community.
I could just chime in briefly on that too, because I was struck by Trish saying, if I understood you correctly earlier, saying you have a lot of junior reviewers reviewing more senior people, which was just never, ever, ever happened at our journal, or almost never.
They're all different.
Yeah, so the disciplinary paradigm could be very different. So in other words, no offense, but we'd never call on you, our journal. However, if you wrote us cold and said, hey, I would like to get some experience copy editing, would you mind if I took a look at a couple of papers? Sure, I'd send you a manuscript. And if at the end of your copy editing memo, or however you've marked up the paper, you said, hey, by the way, I didn't really understand, or I didn't really agree with the argument in section 4 or something, nobody's going to say you overstepped your bounds. So I think contacting them directly and asking what's available is just a very easy thing to do.
That's a great segue into my question, which is any advice for people who are interested in getting into editing?
Which kind? Your kind?
Yeah, copy editing or managing editors, or what kind of editing? There's actually different kinds.
I'm interested in more of the content managing editor. I don't know if others are interested in copying.
Yeah, well, at the press, there's a tendency to hire from within. So I actually I was the main copy editor for the American Naturalist, and when the managing editorship came open, they said, hey, why don't you apply? I would say, yeah, it's again, it's a very fluid field, and there isn't a lot of necessarily money going on. That's the problem. Managing editors, of course, well, let me change this. Content editors, the academic editors, are volunteers. The actual people who control the content are the academics or the scholars, whoever's setting up that journal. So particularly small journals might be looking for people to get involved with the editorial board, and but journal office staff and copy editing, these are actually professions. If you go onto LinkedIn, there's a lot of groups out there that are talking to each other about academic publishing. So I would say tune into that, and that's also their listing jobs.
But in terms of becoming an academic editor, the automatic step to that is you pretty much have to have been on at least one consulting board beforehand. A consulting board is essentially a list of people who have gone public to the journal about their willingness to review a substantial number of papers. In the 1980s, we did 20 papers a year for the American Journal of Sociology as consulting editors. Now people will do only 10. But that's the way into this. Nobody's going to take you as an editor straight out. You're going to have to have been a consulting editor first. They know you've seen a lot of stuff. You know how to do that kind of thing.
Great. We have time for maybe one more question. Anyone else? Yeah, back there.
Do you have any suggestions for what to include in an abstract to make it more, whatever it needs to be catching?
Abstract, I'll give you my theory of abstracts, but which I think, it depends heavily on whether it's something that has is sort of scientific in leaning or something else. The central thing about the abstract is it needs to contain an entire crucial structure of your argument. So the easiest thing to talk about would be a relatively scientific paper. It needs to have, I'm evaluating these theories, this was my data, these are the kinds of methods I used, and these were the answers. And it needs to have that in about 150 words, which is a real art form. But the way to find good abstracts is to look at the abstracts in first quality journals, because the managing editors, who are the people who believe in wonderful abstracts, have rewritten 90% of those abstracts to make them decent. So it's pretty easy to figure out what needs to go, and when you think about, you're trying to case a journal to see, is this the right place? Read the abstracts, and you'll see that, oh, this is the way they want it summarized. So there's plenty of good examples out there that managing editors have made sure of that. Now that's true only at the sort of elite level. You know, once you get below the top, in sociology there are around 120 journals total. Once you get below the top about 20 journals, you're already in an area where the managing editor is actually probably somebody sitting at Sage Publications who, graduated from the University of Michigan in English 3 or 4 years ago. So you can't rely on that. I would go to the very top of the status system, because that's where they actually have the resources to do this kind of rewriting. Copy editing itself is kind of dying further down the system.
I would also say one way to think about it is just like a newspaper lead. Who, what, why, where, when. You know, you're setting it up, the whole picture. You know, if your audience only reads this, they know what your article's about.
I think in humanities and social sciences, well, maybe less so in social sciences, but in humanities, where single authorship is the kind of coin of the realm, there's also a corresponding or corollary feeling that, this is my project, this is my big play, I don't want to give it away. We see abstracts written very haphazardly, but people are loath in general to tell you up front what their article is about, whether it's at the beginning, whether it's as a prospect or in an abstract. But it's not a murder mystery. It's the opposite. You need to say first what the conclusion is. You really do. There's no tease, there's no reveal, just say it.